Welcome to this GCSJ event, hosted by the Centre for Global Challenges and Social Justice at the Open University. Our topic today is teaching equitably about climate change, linking higher education research with school teaching.
Thank you ever so much to everybody who's joined us this evening. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am Parvati Raghuram. I'm the Professor of Geography and Migration at the Open University. We had a big project called DEPA, which is the first logo that you can see there, it's called Decolonizing Education for Peace in Africa. It was a project which ran across 14 African countries and had 16 projects under it, with one of those projects was in Cameroon. And as part of that, we looked at the question of climate change. And this conversation today is based upon that. And we'll introduce you a little bit more to that. But first, let me tell you a little bit of the background. So the project was funded by the EHRC. By the ESRC. DEPA was funded by the EHRC, but then this teaching materials were funded by the ESRC. And here we have today various people from the team. So the first, can I introduce Melis Cin, and she is at Lancaster University in the Department of Education, senior lecturer there, and has been working tirelessly on this project for a long time. Second is Manu Lekunze, who's lecturer at Aberdeen University and was in charge of the Cameroon research project itself. And then is Dan Whittall, who is from the GA, but is also a teacher at school and has multiple other roles in life. He has, big in the unions and all sorts of things. So he's a wonderful person, and it's been a pleasure to work with him over the last couple of years. And he's at the GA. And then the person we don't have here is Chris Winter, who was also at the GA and without whose huge contribution we wouldn't be here today. To chair our session today, we have George Revel, and thank you very much, George, for joining us. George is a professor at the Open University, and he is in the geography department as well, has done massive and really influential and interesting things on climate change, and how do you actually do soundscape around climate change, how do you do creative responses to climate change, and how do you teach about it at schools in the UK. So really very much resonates with the work that we have done. So it's a pleasure to have him here to kind of not only mind us, but also to chip in and shape the conversations today. So before I hand over to the others, let me say a little bit about this event today. So we're talking about climate change, which itself is beginning to feel quite brave as the spaces for discussing these things close down. So in some ways, I want to say this because I think the ability to teach about climate change and to make the space to discuss this is something that we must defend in the future. So I really sincerely hope that, this is that we will all take that away, if not anything else, that it is really important to do this. The second thing that I would like to say is that we wanted to use resources which are drawing on materials from the Global South, from a research project, to put that into teaching materials. We've done that consistently across DEPA, but in this instance, we were specifically focusing on school teaching in the UK in the 11 to 14-year-olds group. What we do through that is what we call something called creative and connective learning. And for those who might be interested, the last week of March, we have a whole lot of afternoon sessions where we actually develop this notion of creative and connective learning. And in doing that, we talk about 3 types of connected learning. One of them is spatially across different places. So Cameroon material is used to help to teach in the UK, while we help to teach based on what we have learned about in the UK. We help to produce teaching materials in Cameroon. We also try to share these materials both across schools and universities. So that's one form of created and connected learning. Another one is to work across community groups, researchers, and school teachers and university teachers. So trying to break down the kind of academic and research and community silos within which we often operate. right? And the third one is the kind of temporal aspect of it. One of the things we were interested in is what are the colonial inheritances of climate change? How did it come? How did we come to be here? And what responses do we have? And this kind of is an opportunity for us to cut away from thinking about climate change as something which does to put climate change into the conversation of around reparations and coloniality, and to firmly embed it in those conversations. And I think that's a third form of creative and connected learning. I say creative because we have used creativity across the projects as input, as a methodology, and as an output. And you'll see some of it here in today's talk. And with that brief introduction to this topic of global inequalities and the climate crisis and what we did with this, I'll pass it over to Melis, who'll talk to you a little bit about the teaching and the introduction to the project itself. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Parvati. And this is Melis Cin from Lancaster University. I'm going to be talking about some of the principles and some of our motivations of how we approach these teaching materials. So, as Parvati said, our project seeks the our project aims to bring everyday narratives of global South communities into geography education and to create engaging teaching materials in order to address the rising calls for anti-racism, but also more equitable ways of teaching within the curriculum. So in developing these materials, we had three overarching motivations, which we could call aims to achieve. And also there was a particular reason why we focused on key stage 3, actually teaching materials, because it provides a much more flexibility to introduce actually supplementary materials to the schools and to the teaching spaces. So to talk about our first motivation, it was about to ensure that EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion perspectives were introduced into the teaching materials. And when you look into the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC reports, they also stress the necessity for teaching practices that recognize complex interplay of human actions, colonial legacies, but also their far-reaching impacts on global inequalities. So we aim to integrate more diverse narratives and perspectives. So that was our first motivation. And secondly, again related to EDI perspective, we aim to disrupt the stereotypical narratives of the ways in which Africa has been told in the past. Again, if you look into the all-party parliamentary group, APPG Africa Education Inquiry reports, what you will see is that there is a pressing need for educational materials to move beyond the Eurocentric perspectives, especially concerning the discussions surrounding the climate change, and all these actually discussions, the reports and the literature advocates for empowering teachers to present a more nuanced view of Africa, shifting away from narratives of dominated by poverty or dysfunction, and calls for collaboration, particularly between teachers and African diaspora communities. And lastly, our aim was to foster a learning environment where students could gain insights from the experiences of Cameroonian people, connect with them and their everyday life realities, and we want to ensure that the students in the UK get a well-rounded understanding of the extent to which climate crises are impacting the lives of people in Cameroon and the ways in which people resist these impacts. Therefore, we paid a particular attention to starting with everyday experiences or everyday perspectives in the global north to make those connections, as Parvati was saying, the connected learning aspect of the project to the global south, rather than beginning with the Cameroonian actually narrative. So our aim was to connect the lives of the students in the UK with those in Cameroon through very simple practices of everyday life. For instance, considering how using a piece of furniture produced from timber sourced in Cameroon can be seen or connected with the climate crisis and deforestation that people have been experiencing. So in response to all these growing concerns and also the debates in the literature, actually, our project aimed to achieve the objectives of increasing knowledge of different experiences of climate crisis, but also diversifying teaching materials in the UK with an anti-racist emphasis on foregrounding the African community voices and experiences. So I'm just now going to pass on to Manu, who is going to be talking about Cameroonian project more in detail.
Thank you very much, Melis and Parvati. So Melis and Parvati have already talked about the aims of the project, what we wanted to do. So I'll just briefly talk about what we actually did with regards to the research on the ground. We really wanted to understand different aspects of conflict, peace, and the relationship with climate change. And Cameroon happens to be in one of those regions when you think about climate change in Africa, you think about the shrinking of the Lake Chad region or desertification in the Sahel region. The Lake Chad Basin region is the immediate basin region is somewhere near Chad and Nigeria. Cameroon's far north region is actually not very far from the lake itself. So that's part of the place where we did some of the research. We did interviews. So we interviewed all kinds of people, from government officials, teachers, farmers, traders. We also had focus groups in terms of data collection. We had focus groups with ordinary people, with artists, with teachers. By the time we finished the data collection and everything, if you add the number of the one-to-one interviews and the focus group, we engaged more than 115 people. The interviews were around 60. Some of them were displaced, so we had focus groups in the capital city in Yaoundé with internally displaced people. We had about 3 different focus groups. So at the end of it, we collected quite a lot of data, including stuff that we collected from documents and history. So the project became really, really big in terms of the data that we have. And we are still analyzing the data. This particular climate change materials is part of or a byproduct of the research. There's a lot of other things that we're doing in terms of using the same understanding or the same knowledge that we've got from the research to advise on policies regarding the use of education in peace and security, as well as a forthcoming CPD on how we can raise awareness within teachers and other stakeholders in security and the education sector on the relationship between education and security, especially connected to climate change in these regions that are challenged by climate change. So that's a brief of the actual research, and I'm happy to take questions so I can give more details later. Let me pass it on to Dan to give more details.
Thanks very much, Manu. Thanks very much, Melis, and thanks, Parvati, for that really generous introduction at the start. I'm just going to try and get the PowerPoint back on, so bear with me just a moment. This has been a really interesting project for me to work on. Like Parvati said at the start, I work for the Geographical Association. I do that 2 days a week in a research engagement lead role. That role's been job shared with Chris Winter. Chris can't be here tonight, unfortunately, but she has been really important to the development of the materials, at least on the Geographical Association's end. But I think one of the things to emphasise right from the get-go, and hopefully it comes across from the number of speakers we've got tonight and from the nature of the contributions, is that this was a really collaborative and participatory project. One of the really I think quite innovative aspects of this project in terms of school curriculum resource development is the partnership working that went on and went into this. And it really was significant partnership working. There were a lot of hours of meetings, of finding alignment on issues relating to education and relating to how best to try and package this material. And I just want to start really by thanking everyone that's been involved in the project. From my perspective, it's been a really exciting thing to work on, and I think we've ended up with a really innovative project that came out of a tremendous amount of work in all sorts of different ways from all sorts of different people. I mean, we've got a number of the direct participants here, but just to add on some of the other people on the screen here who've been involved, we had Alicia, who was involved as a engaged teacher working in a UK school context, who produced some initial resources and reviewed some of the later resources. And there've been a variety of people throughout the project who've played a role in collecting ethnographic research and sort of helping us to repackage this material and to recontextualize it in the specific ways that we've been able to do so. What I'm going to do tonight is try and just build on what's been said so far by talking a bit more specifically about the materials and about the curriculum resources that we've ended up with. Just to recap in terms of some of the priorities, I guess, that we were sort of setting ourselves at the get-go, the Geographical Association had done some research just before this project began with school geography teachers in the UK context in England, where it identified a need and a hunger and an interest in more diverse, more anti-racist teaching resources, resources that were able to try and package academic research up for them and that were able to go beyond some of the already existing material, especially when it came to teaching about the African continent. Melis mentioned this all-party parliamentary group for Africa's inquiry report in 2022. There were some really key phrases from that and key findings in that report, which really did drive our understanding of the important contribution this project could make. For instance, that report found an impoverished treatment of Africa in the school curriculum. This is in the English context, replete with misconceptions. I really do recommend reading that report if you're interested in finding out more about some of the issues and challenges, but also some of the good work that's been ongoing in recent years around education in the UK context around Africa and African issues. We really wanted to take seriously some of the findings in that research and that report and some of the assertions, this idea that the mere inclusion of information about Africa in a curriculum cannot secure the transformation of young people's understanding, I think was quite important for us. It's not just about teaching about Africa more. The report argues that teaching about Africa should allow for discussion and debate, and we've tried to bring that in to the resources by foregrounding discussions and debates that are far beyond the English or the UK educational context, and ideally by foregrounding the experiences and the voices that came through from the ethnographic material that Manu and others were able to bring to the project from close community working in Cameroon itself. So across this, the kind of really ambitious priority or really ambitious aim was to try and develop a practical collaboration between academic researchers, school teachers, the Geographical Association as a UK-based subject association, and also through the researchers with communities in the area being represented in the educational resources. I think that idea of educational resources as representational is quite an important one. Parvati's talked about these principles, this idea of creative and connected learning, but it's also important, I think, especially as teachers and educators in UK schools, to remember that one thing we're doing when we're presenting educational materials is we're representing people, we're representing places, we're representing communities, and then to take that a step further and ask ourselves questions about how we do that faithfully, sensitively, justly, and fairly, I think is really significant. Just because I'm guessing not everybody on the meeting tonight will properly understand where these resources fit in the school curriculum in England when we say things like Key Stage 3 and so on and so forth. Just to make really clear exactly what that means, the resource designed for use in the teaching of school geography in secondary schools, secondary school education in England begins after age 11. Key Stage 3 is the first phase of that secondary phase. So it's approximately ages 11 to 14. It's before students move on to what gets called GCSE geography. So this was, I guess, our target audience for the materials, the people who would be on the receiving end of whatever the representational forms were that we produced, and the teachers who teach at this phase in particular. The Key Stage 3 geography curriculum set out by the UK government states that students should become aware of increasingly complex geographical systems in the world around them at this phase. And it also specifies a need to develop place knowledge of a region within Africa, as well as detailed place-based exemplars of change in climate. So this was one of the reasons why we decided this was an appropriate educational phase to try and produce the research, the resources. Another really valuable aspect of this, though, is speaks back to what Melis said earlier, which is that at Key Stage 3, there's a little more freedom in terms of the kinds of curriculum development work that can be done. Once you move into older age categories, into GCSE and A-level resources, one constraint, it's not necessarily always problematic, but it's a constraint that operates on teachers in terms of what sorts of work they try to do, what sorts of resources they might be open to using, and so on, is obviously the exam-based nature of those GCSE and A-level qualifications. So teachers are going to have a focus on exam specifications and on exam questions and the sort of examification of education. Whereas at Key Stage 3, the teachers themselves have much more control over how the topics they're teaching are assessed. And so that gives us a bit of freedom within the bounds of curriculum, of pedagogies, of assessment, and so on to shape resources that are a little more appropriate and fitting for the recontextualization and translation of some of these complex and hopefully engaging materials that we've been able to produce. That's not to say that the materials are useless at that phase. And one of the things we had in mind was that the resources should be packaged in a way that meant that parts of them, aspects of them, or even in places all of them could translate across into other phases of the education system. So, for instance, a teacher in a geography department might find in these resources or lessons or aspects of them that could usefully inform things they teach as part of their GCSE at Key Stage 4, and they could themselves repackage them as part of their curriculum making work into materials that fit the climate change topic in paper 1, the physical geography aspect, where students have to explore the possible causes of climate change, human factors. They have to be able to provide an overview of the effects of climate change on people and the environment. So clearly the Cameroonian case material and the ethnographic research we've got here could be really valuable in that context. Also, students have to look at changing economic world. There's a topic in there about some causes of uneven development, including historical causes, and so we were mindful of the sort of significance of kind of creating a package of resources that explicitly is framed at one of these phases of education, but opens out so that teachers themselves might be able to deploy them in whatever context they think is most suitable. To sit alongside the resources, we've created a teacher pack to help the teachers understand and engage with the materials. There's 2 or 3 reasons for this. First is just to make clear one set of ways within which the resources might be used, and one set of sort of directions for how the teachers might think about using them. And another is also to make clear to teachers that these resources are a representation of our interpretation of the ethnographic material and of the context and situation in association with global inequalities and the climate crisis in Cameroon. Just to remind teachers that this is one particular story, one particular narrative. There may be other ways of using these materials that teachers will find for themselves. This teacher pack really was to guide the teachers in thinking creatively as curriculum makers themselves about how they might use these resources and materials in lessons. So I imagine the font is really small here and you might not be able to make this out, but I thought I'd put it on the screen just in case, just to talk you through the narrative flow of the lessons. Obviously, the overarching inquiries into global inequalities and the climate crisis viewed through a Cameroonian lens, or the lens of a Cameroonian case study. And the idea is that the lessons and the learning is sequenced to take students through an inquiry into that topic. So it begins with an initial lesson looking at how is the climate crisis impacting on people's lives around the world. This was quite important to our way of thinking, and it really came from Parvati, Melis, and Manu insisting early on as part of the project, and all of us sort of agreeing that this was a really good way to do it. That it's really important to connect students spatially. I think this is what Parvati was referring to earlier on. It's a kind of educational imperative to draw connections between contexts and situations, and not to try and isolate or view Cameroon as though it's an individual example that's kind of detached from other places, and to treat the case study such as it is as a kind of a unique exemplar of something, but actually to situate it in its broader context. I'm going to share some examples of resources that we developed to try and do that in a moment, and to try and help teachers to do that. Lesson 2 is then under the broad umbrella of why study climate change in Cameroon. Introduces the case study, talks a little bit about Cameroon as a country. That's important, especially because by the time students enter Key Stage 3 in geography, it's It's unlikely many of them have engaged directly with Cameroon in much of their geography learning previously. And so we wanted to make sure that these resources are really practical and useful for teachers, and will do the introductory groundwork of setting out what Cameroon is as a country, what the context of its geographical location is, how it's situated, but also to get students understanding and engaging with the nature of that country, and the sort of regional geography of the country, the physical geography of the country, understanding the different areas of the country, and some of the similarities and differences within that, as well as the ways in which climate change is having environmental impacts on those regions in slightly different ways. Lesson 3 then moves into a discussion of how is deforestation contributing to environmental change in Cameroon. The focus on deforestation came, I think, first and foremost from the ethnographic material. The theme of deforestation was identified early on as one that was discussed in a number of different extracts, a number of the interviews that we were sort of basing this educational material on. But it was also really clear that deforestation means different things in different places. That deforestation is one of those themes that can do some of this spatial linking work that Parvati talks about. Deforestation happens in lots of different places and different contexts. It's not isolated to Cameroon. It's something that happens in the UK, and there's an educational impetus there to try and teach that and engage young people in thinking about the similarities and differences of deforestation in different geographical contexts, but also to think about the different causes of deforestation, the different drivers of it, the way in which there are sort of local demands and needs, and sort of necessities as well as desires that drive it, as well as more global impacts and more global drivers associated with global trade and historical factors and all sorts of other things. So we identified that as a theme, and thought that was well worth a specific lesson where we could do a kind of follow the thing approach in some ways, link the patterns of deforestation to global commodities and global trade, and also try and engage young people in English school geography classrooms with this idea that deforestation is complex. It's got complex global geographies, that those global geographies connect you directly to Cameroon and to climate change and to some of the inequities and inequalities, but also some of the things that are being done in Cameroon around this, and some of the reasons why deforestation takes place, and some of the strategies that are being used to mitigate its impacts or adapt to it. So the last couple of lessons then shift directly into some of the really complex conceptual material, looking at the concept of inequalities, exploring what inequalities means as a geographical context in a global as a geographical concept in a global context. And also then grounding that in Cameroon and through the experiences of everyday folk in Cameroon and their understanding of inequalities within Cameroon, between people, between communities, between groups, but also between people in Cameroon and people in the UK, or people in Cameroon and people elsewhere as well. Last but not least, we wanted to really end the lessons with a kind of hopeful imperative, or an imperative that centers African agency, so that we're not across the materials centering Cameroonian victimness or creating deficit-based narratives of Cameroon that center just on what climate change is doing to Cameroon, but speak back actually to what Cameroonian people are doing to negotiate and work with and work against some of the global forces that have been driving climate change, and to adapt and show active agency as individuals, groups, and communities operating in a climatically changing context, but able to act within that and act with hope and act with agency. We thought that was really important. So that last lesson really does center individual experiences, but also enables students to debate and discuss, and has a kind of role play section where students encounter a number of stakeholders based on real people from the ethnographic material, and get to imagine what it would be like to be in those contexts and working in those situations, and exploring some of the possible options and directions that are being taken by Cameroonian governments, civil society groups, and so on. So that's an overview really of the sort of thing that's going on. And I'm just going to present a couple of the resources here that hopefully flesh out a little bit of what we've been talking about there. I mentioned this idea of trying to situate Cameroon in its global context. There are a variety of ways in which we try to do this through the resources, but this is just one example of one worksheet that seeks to do that. very early on in the opening lesson, where we're talking about the climate crisis and the global nature of that climate crisis. And rather than isolating that to one individual local context, students work with a map where they can engage with a variety of different impacts in rural contexts and urban contexts across all different continents across the world. They can start to examine some of the similarities and differences in terms of how climate change is impacting on different places in similar and different ways, and start to appreciate some of the geographical complexity of climate change as a global issue. Here's an example of a resource that was used to try and situate the case study in the context of a changing global system. This is a resource known in school geography in England as a guided reading resource. It's the kind of thing that would be worked with, where teachers would work with their class to work through the text, engage the class in discussion of that text, and then analyze it and respond to it using some of the question boxes around the outside. These things were quite complex to pull together. The content was, it's sophisticated. It's introducing quite challenging material that even some of the teachers may not necessarily be overly familiar with. It tries to position Cameroon as a country with a history of coloniality, a complex history of coloniality, multiple occupations and different dimensions, but also a context where that isn't the singular and determining factor in Cameroonian history. It's a part and a parcel of it that helps us understand Cameroon's position within global inequalities and the climate crisis today, but it's an aspect of it, and it's set within a more complex and ongoing global system where there are inequalities of global trade, and Cameroon has acted in the past and continues to act today within that global context. Trying to introduce that in just a couple of hundred words of text that is accessible for students aged between 11 and 13 generally, and that will be engaging and accessible for those students. It's a real challenge, and we worked really hard and went through a lot of phases of reviewing this material, sharing it with teachers in schools to get feedback on it, and then revising it again to try and make it more accessible and more engaging. It went through multiple iterations, and it's so far been really well received by some of the teachers that have set it to work in classrooms. Some of the resources explicitly, or many of the resources explicitly foreground the experiences of Cameroonian people because, as Parvati, Melis and Manu said at the start, this was really at the center of the project, trying to get as many extracts from the ethnographic material as we could do, to try and ensure that Cameroonian experiences and voices were speaking back to English classrooms and were at the center of the teaching and the education that was going on, so that knowledges and experiences from Cameroon were driving really the learning that was going on. So sometimes that took the form that it does on the screen here, where students were engaging with quotes, extracts, short parcels of text. Other times it was a single extract from a single individual. So here's one particular quote that was used to look at the global inequalities lesson towards the end, where students would read a quote here from an environmentalist working in northern Cameroon, and then engage in discussion with their peers of what was going on here, and to kind of critically engage with that as well, to treat this as a source of knowledge about climate change and a source of knowledge about issues affecting people in northern Cameroon that they could engage in critical discussion of, and start to compare with things they might have learned in other contexts, things they might have heard about either Africa or about the issue of climate change, and to help them sort of think about some of the various and many different contexts in which these materials are getting them to think. So the ethnographic material was in there and was driving the learning and driving the resources, but it did so in different ways in different points across this series of 5 lessons. Here's a short extract from the stakeholder cards. This is just one example for the role play towards the end, where, as I say, we took lived experiences and stories from the ethnographic material and sort of summarized them into little stakeholder cards that enabled the students to work in groups, developing empathy and thinking of what it would be like to work in the context and to have the concerns of some of the people that had contributed to the ethnographic material. And all of the concerns on here were concerns that were taken from that ethnographic material, summarized and again repackaged and recontextualized in language that would be accessible for students at the age that they were at. And the students would get the opportunity to take on the role of a number of these different characters and to discuss what they thought would be the priorities for them in their particular position, their context, their lived experience, what sorts of things they were negotiating, what challenges they were accommodating to, and how they thought that climate change could best be mitigated and addressed in the context of the global inequalities that Cameroon is situated within. So, I mean, there's lots going on here. There really is in terms of the resources. I think they're really innovative. I think the idea of repackaging and recontextualizing ethnographic material in the way that we've done here is a really important one. It's a model that clearly can't work in every context. It's complex, it's challenging, and it's above all else time consuming if you're going to do it and do it really well. But it is really important, I think, that we try to find ways as best we can to cross the interface, or what sometimes gets called the divide between academic geography and school geography, or between any academic subject and its sort of school-connected relations. It's important because, first of all, the academic and ethnographic material can really inform some of the work that gets done in some of these contexts, but it can also shape teachers and do educational work for teachers in terms of rethinking Eurocentric perceptions and assumptions, trying to avoid or work against deficit representations of countries like Cameroon, of the people that live there, and of the continent of Africa as a whole. One of the things that I thought was really interesting about this project was the way it helped me think a lot more critically about the idea of what it means to decolonize the curriculum. And I think that might be something that would be interesting to talk about later on in terms of the way in which the project unfolded. This context of decolonizing the curriculum being something that's become very buzzword, but that actually is very, very complex and very challenging. And there are all sorts of ethical questions of representation, questions of recontextualization that make that very hard and very challenging in the context of the kind of applied learning and doing of it in specific classroom contexts. And also, I thought back to things that people had said through the project, and I forget exactly who said it, but somebody partway through, whilst we were in one of our meetings, asked the question, what will our work look like in 10 years' time? How will people look back on the material that's been produced through this project? What sorts of things will be said and thought about it in that context? And I think as an educational question, thinking about what it means to build creative and connected learning, I think that was one that I really took away from the work that we've done here as being something I've tried to use to inform my own teaching in classrooms in other contexts. And right at the center of this was what it says at the bottom there, trying to represent stories of hope and agency for and from the global south, specifically in the context of Cameroon here. So I mean, there's lots of other things we could say about this. I think at this point, it's probably good if I stop for now, actually, and maybe just take the presentation back to the overview of the resources. I'll pop that back on the board, and yeah, I'm not exactly sure who I'm handing over to now, but just maybe to hand over to sort of question and discussion and open things up at this stage. Parvati, Melis, Manu, does anyone want to come in at this stage and follow on from me, or?
I had a few things to say. First and foremost, wonderful. It's really great to see the materials. Thank you so much. The second thing to say is that you can't produce these materials without having huge fallouts and arguments. And, and we had our share of those. And I think that's really important to say, because I think creative and connected learning is not simply frictionless, right? We didn't understand what school teaching materials look like. I'm still not 100% sure I completely understand how it gets used. I think so all of us were coming at this from very particular perspectives. And in all of this are a whole lot of people who are not here, right? So for instance, we went to Cameroon, we did some, work with school teachers. We did some work in schools. So a lot of time, effort, and thought went into it. There were research assistants there who was questioning us, and who should be, or sometimes weren't and should have been questioning us more hard. So there are a lot of people to whom we are answerable when we produce this teaching material, right? And they are not just, they're in schools here, but they're also in schools teaching and in daily lives in Cameroon. And how do you kind of translate that answerability? How do you live that responsibility through, right? And that's kind of really the question that that when we do this translation work, right, when we try to get together. And it's been a huge learning experience for me as well, because working with Manu, for instance, right, I hadn't understood certain things, like, for instance, don't start with your history with, 1886 and the 1880, the Berlin Conference. That's where, and then the use of the word pre-colonial, the fact that we use as if the coloniality marks the beginning of something. There are so many things that we had to go back and think, okay, that's not appropriate. This is not appropriate. We couldn't have done this without a Cameroonian, right? And that's the crucial part, is that you can't do this kind of teaching without a huge investment in the decolonial world. So, for instance, Dan and I have been in the Decolonizing Teachers school teaching group for probably 3-4 years. You've probably, since it started, probably started it yourself. So it's incredible engagement, and then a lot of time spent supporting those teachers, thinking with them, learning about things that they're talking about, tuning in. And really, for the first 2-3 years, your job is just to shut up and listen, right, to what the teachers are talking about. And then you might say, actually individually be able to say, if somebody asks you a question, you might be able to reply. But to begin with, that's all it is. So, but hanging around, lurking for 3-4 years in that school teachers group, as many academics do, actually. There's a whole lot of us. And then we also in lots of other subgroups, the Africa teaching group, the this teaching group, that teaching group, the Salam Geographies group. So we are in multiple groups. And so what it takes is a commitment. So you don't go into these things, superficially saying, I will produce some teaching materials or this, that, the other. You've got to kind of really engage, and you've got to engage with the voices and actually center, not even, I couldn't have done this without both, of course, not for me, the learning was really from everybody, but Manu would insist that, yes, this bit you can't say about Cameroon, that bit you can't say. So continuously being questioned about what you can say and what you can't say. And that's what it takes to produce good teaching materials. Yeah. So yeah, that's just, I just wanted to lay out that it's not an easy win, but it's a big win, right? And you've got to have faith that at the end of it, you'll all come away learning a lot of things, but path may not be easy. But it's not worth doing it otherwise, because I think we have enough of poor teaching materials around. And maybe this, I'm sure we can all say, we could have done things better, but this is one step along the way.
Thank you for watching this GCSJ event. Please subscribe to this channel, follow us on social media, or visit our website to learn more about the GCSJ Centre and future events.